Everyone laughed when the maid walked into the courtroom, her shoes worn, her hands rough, her uniform stained from years of labor. They thought she was lost, a joke, a mistake. But what happened next silenced the room. Because the woman they mocked wasn't there to clean, she was there to judge. The grand courtroom echoed with soft laughter as the doors creaked open. She stepped in quietly, unnoticed at first, until the clack of her low, worn heels struck the polished marble like a foreign sound in a place meant for polished power. Her uniform was unmistakable, navy blue, starched but faded, the kind of fabric worn by those who clean up after others have already left. Heads turned. Smirks followed. She walked slowly, chin not quite high, but not bowed either. The stiff leather of her handbag pressed against her ribs like armor. Her eyes scanned the room not nervously, but deliberately, as if she was memorizing every detail. But to the rest of the room she was a misplaced figure, out of sync with the people in pinstripes and polished leather, the ones whose pens clicked with impatience and whose briefcases bore initials in gold. Laughter flickered again, this time bolder. Someone in the third row elbowed the man beside him and whispered with a grin, "She thinks she's here to testify or to vacuum." The man didn't bother whispering back. He laughed loud enough for others to join in. At the plaintiff's table, Mr. Hadley adjusted his designer tie and leaned back with casual arrogance. A corporate titan known for eating small claims for breakfast. To him, this case was just another routine day. What wasn't routine was the woman who had walked in through the main door, as if she belonged here. "She must be lost," someone said, their voice cutting through the still air like a judge's gavel. But she wasn't. She walked to the front row and sat down, not in the witness box, not in the back with spectators, but just a breath away from the clerk's bench. The room stilled for a moment, confused by her placement. One bailiff stepped forward, unsure, but then paused. Something about her composure stopped him. Even as the room simmered with suppressed laughter, she did not flinch. Her hands rested gently in her lap. Her eyes remained still, not defiant, not scared, just still. It was the kind of calm that made noise feel loud and unnecessary. In contrast, the rest of the courtroom pulsed with manufactured confidence. Suits shuffled, phones silenced with subtle clicks. Lawyers reviewed notes they wouldn't need, because everyone thought they already knew how this would go. This wasn't just a case. It was a showcase. The defendant, a cleaning company manager, sat flushed and uncomfortable, knowing he'd be chewed up in court. The plaintiff, Miss Hadley, had brought him here over a minor contract breach, one that probably should have been settled in a coffee shop, not a courtroom. But Hadley enjoyed theater, and in this case, he'd brought his whole entourage. Then, a slight hush, a door opened near the bench, and people began to rise automatically. The judge was about to enter, but then the bailiff spoke, breaking protocol. "Court will be in session shortly. Please remain seated until instructed." Confusion returned. The judge hadn't arrived, but the bailiff had spoken as if she was already here. And still, the maid sat motionless. Whispers now turned sharper. "Why isn't she being asked to leave? She's in the wrong seat. Who let her in here?" Mr. Hadley leaned over to his assistant and sneered. "I bet she's here to clean after the session. Poor thing thinks it starts early." His voice wasn't low. He wanted her to. She did. But she didn't move. The courtroom doors shut again behind her with a loud clack. The echoes danced around the vaulted ceilings like a closing argument. The atmosphere shifted slightly, not enough to notice, but just enough to tighten the room's air. The clerk stood now, oddly poised, eyes glancing to the woman in uniform. Mr. Hadley stretched his neck and exhaled like a man already victorious. But behind all of it, behind the murmurs, the stares, the superiority, no one asked the obvious question. No one asked why she was here. No one asked what gave her the stillness in the face of mockery, what allowed her to walk into a room filled with power and act as if none of it intimidated her. They only saw the uniform. They only saw the shoes. They only saw what they expected. And because of that, no one was ready for what came next. What no one in that room realized not the lawyers, not the spectators, not even the ones who laughed, was that the most powerful person in that courtroom was already sitting quietly at the front, waiting for her moment. And that moment was closer than anyone dared imagine. They saw a maid. That's all they saw. To them, she was just another woman in uniform, a service worker, a background figure, the kind of person who holds elevator doors and silently disappears before important conversations begin. But behind that faded blue uniform was a story no one in that courtroom could have imagined. Not the lawyers, not the bailiffs, and certainly not Mr. Hadley. Her name was Elena Morales. Born in the dry borderlands of New Mexico, raised in a 2-bedroom trailer with 4 siblings and a mother who scrubbed motel floors long after midnight, Elena grew up with the smell of bleach in her lungs and the sound of her mother's back cracking every time she bent to mop a hallway. She learned early that silence was survival. While other children played outside, Elena sat on milk crates behind the convenience store, reading borrowed books under buzzing neon lights. The law fascinated her, not for its glamour but for its power. She saw how rules shaped lives, how signatures decided fates, and she made herself a quiet promise. One day she wouldn't just follow the rules, she'd write them. But promises don't pay bills. When her mother fell sick, Elena dropped out of her scholarship program at the university. Law school was replaced with hospital visits and endless night shifts. She became a cleaner, just like her mother. It wasn't a step backward, it was a detour forged by love and duty. She didn't complain, she worked. Apartment lobbies, executive offices, hotel ballrooms, she scrubbed them all, always invisible, always efficient. Yet the spark inside her never dimmed. She kept her textbooks, studied during coffee breaks, took the bar exam in secret 3 times after working double shifts. No one knew, not even the other maids she worked beside. They saw her as kind, quiet, tired, maybe, but never ambitious, never powerful. And that's exactly how she wanted it. For now, back in the courtroom, the humiliation continued. One of Hadley's interns laughed as she pulled out a bottle of water from her bag. The kind of laughter that says you don't belong here. Another pointed their phone subtly, pretending to text, but snapping a photo. A meme in the making. A joke waiting to go viral. Even the stenographer smirked when she adjusted her seat, like someone tolerating an interruption, not witnessing a person. And still, Elena said nothing. Because she was used to being underestimated. Used to being overlooked, mispronounced, and dismissed. But what none of them knew, what couldn't be seen from a uniform, was that Elena held more legal certifications than most people in that courtroom. She had worked in pro bono clinics under a pseudonym, helping undocumented families navigate impossible legal systems. She had once clerked anonymously for a federal judge as part of a shadow program designed to elevate underrepresented talent. Her uniform was a costume, not of deception, but of patience. Every insult thrown at her was another layer added to her armor. They thought she was background, but she had always been studying the foreground. As Hadley leaned back, sipping his coffee smugly, confident that this would be another easy win, Elena's eyes locked briefly on the file in front of him. The same contract dispute she had been reviewing for weeks, the same legal trap he had set for the defendant, a working-class janitorial contractor who'd missed a fine print clause designed to bankrupt him. She had seen this trick before. Hadley was known for it. Sign contracts with small firms, plant audible clauses, wait for failure, then sue them into silence. But this time, something felt different. Elena wasn't here to clean the courtroom. She was here to clean the system. The echoes of laughter that had followed her entry were starting to fade now. Not because people had grown kinder, but because something about her stillness unsettled them. Her presence was too calm, too precise. She didn't shrink like most do when mocked. She didn't fidget or avoid eye contact. She simply waited, and waiting, in the right hands, is a weapon. Outside the courthouse, her old Honda Civic sat parked beneath a crooked tree, sun-faded and humble. In the trunk were neatly packed boxes labeled court docs, bar licenses, and one marked Judge Morales, pending. It had sat unopened for months, not because she wasn't ready, but because the world wasn't. Until now. Inside, the tension thickened. The judge still hadn't arrived. The courtroom buzzed with confusion. A delay? A substitution? Hadley's assistant whispered. Do you think they sent a temporary? Some cases get pushed through to tired judges. He shrugged. Doesn't matter. This case is a formality. The guy broke contract. We win. End of story. But it wasn't. Because that Maid, the woman they all laughed at, wasn't here by accident. She was here because justice delayed had found the perfect moment to arrive. And in the next few minutes, she wouldn't just change a verdict. She'd change the way everyone in that room looked at power and at those who wear uniforms. The courtroom had shifted from a legal arena to a stage. The audience, a mix of junior attorneys, corporate staffers, and a few curious civilians, was no longer just waiting for a judge. They were waiting to see what the Maid would do next. Some watched in disbelief. Others with thinly veiled amusement. All of them, unknowingly, had begun circle her like spectators at a schoolyard fight. And the ringleader was still Mr. Hadley. He thrived on attention. Flashy in the courtroom, ruthless in negotiations, and arrogant enough to believe that the law itself bent to his convenience. To him, this wasn't a case, it was a performance. And now, there was an unexpected character on stage. One he didn't respect. A cleaning lady sitting near the judge's bench? It was too easy. Someone should get her a mop, he muttered under his breath. Loud enough for rows around him here. Laughter rolled again, crueler this time. No longer whispers but open mockery. Phones began to discreetly film, nothing viral yet. But the potential simmered. Someone from his legal team leaned sideways, raised their phone slightly, and took a photo. Another whispered, caption this, maid of honor presiding today. More laughter. Still, Elena didn't move. She sat in the same seat, eyes forward, posture unshaken. The more the crowd laughed, the more still she became. And that stillness, that refusal to react, only agitated them further. Because people like Hadley didn't understand quiet strength. They mistook it for weakness. They didn't recognize that when someone doesn't respond to humiliation, it's not because they're powerless. It's because they don't need to respond. Hadley stood now, walking toward the bailiff's desk. A little too confidently. He tapped on the surface lightly, drawing the attention of those nearby. Is there no decorum anymore? He asked, performing for the crowd. I thought this was a court, not a subway terminal. Chuckles followed. But the bailiff didn't laugh. He glanced once at Elena, then quickly looked away. Hadley wasn't done. He turned, speaking louder now. I don't mean to be insensitive, but some of us are here for real cases, not career day. The room gasped slightly, laughter choked back by the sharpness of the insult. Even the defendant, seated quietly on the opposite side, looked uneasy. He was a simple man, a contract janitor with calloused hands and a look of worry that hadn't left his face since the lawsuit began. Even he could feel the room turning venomous. Elena still didn't flinch. Her silence now felt deafening. People began to look at her differently, not with kindness, but with curiosity. Why hadn't she left? Why hadn't anyone made her leave? She wasn't seated in the gallery. She was practically at the bench. That wasn't allowed. So why was it allowed? Something wasn't adding up. A woman in the back, dressed in a paralegal's blazer, lowered her phone mid-recording and squinted. She had seen hundreds of hearings, but never one where a maid sat untouched at the front, just waiting. Whispers spread like wildfire. Did someone forget to tell her the room's not open yet? Why isn't security moving her? Maybe she's special counsel. That suggestion earned a round of disbelief. But no one dismissed it outright. Not anymore. Hadley felt the shift too, but mistook it for attention. He doubled down. Well, he said, adjusting his cufflinks and speaking directly to Elena for the first time. If you're planning to mop up my victory, at least let me know where you'll start. He grinned, proud of the wordplay. The courtroom erupted, some in laughter, some in tension. A few recorded openly now. And Elena? She finally moved. Just her hand, reaching calmly into her worn leather bag. A collective pause. Every eye turned to her. The crowd leaned forward, half expecting her to pull out a cleaning cloth, or maybe a letter of complaint. Anything mundane, anything fitting. Instead, she pulled out a stack of paper, thick, bound, official. She placed it on the desk in front of her without a word. No flourish, no performance, just presence. The crowd quieted. Even Hadley paused, mid-smirk, watching. From where he stood, he could see the heading, Superior Court Judge Certification and Oath. His grin faltered. Briefly. The crowd didn't see what he saw, but the bailiff did, and now the bailiff stood up, formally, deliberately, and tapped the desk twice. All rise. Chairs scraped back. He turned, faced the room, voice louder now. Court is now in session. Presiding, the Honorable Judge Elena Morales. And in an instant, everything stopped. Hadley's jaw tightened. Phones dropped. The smirks vanished like smoke. Even the snide inter froze mid-scroll. Because now the maid they laughed at, the woman they photographed, mocked and insulted, was standing up. Not to leave, but to ascend the bench. The same marble seat meant only for power. And suddenly, everyone realized the joke wasn't on her. It had always been on them. Silence held the courtroom hostage. Every breath was paused. Every eye locked. The laughter that had once bounced off the marble walls was now a ghost. Unwelcome and forgotten. Judge Elena Morales. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap, echoing with a weight no one in that room had expected or believed. She stepped forward now, not as a maid, but as the one person with more authority than anyone who'd mocked her. The faded uniform still clung to her shoulders, but the energy around her had shifted completely. It wasn't a costume anymore, it was a mirror, one that reflected just how blind the room had been. Mr. Hadley's mouth twitched, frozen halfway between disbelief and dawning panic. The bailiff stepped aside as Elena moved toward the elevated bench, still holding the leather bag that now seemed more regal than ragged. She climbed the steps without rushing, placing the thick binder of certifications on the platform. Her eyes scanned the room, not with vengeance, but with calm command. The bench had waited. Now she sat. The courtroom transformed. Gone were the whispers. Gone were the chuckles, the jokes, the sideways glances. What replaced them was a rising unease, a crowd rapidly recalibrating everything they thought they knew. Phones that had been recording quietly were now clutched in stunned hands, unsure whether to keep filming or shut off out of shame. The court clerk's hands trembled slightly as she turned pages on her schedule. The judge's name had been typed clearly at the top. Judge Elena Morales. No one had paid attention. No one had thought to look. Because no one had imagined that a woman in a cleaning uniform could be the one presiding. Elena adjusted the microphone in front of her and tapped once, not to speak, but to restore presence. The simple sound reverberated with quiet authority. She didn't need to announce herself. Her presence now was the announcement. Hadley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His confidence, which had moments ago taken the form of taunts and grins, was crumbling. For the first time in years, he looked small, cornered not by argument, but by truth. He leaned toward his assistant. "This must be some mistake," he whispered hoarsely. It's a stunt. A protest." But the assistant didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the bench, lips parted in disbelief. Slowly, she turned her phone screen toward him. It showed the state judicial website. A profile. A portrait. On Elena Morales. Appointed by the governor's office, confirmed by unanimous committee vote. Superior Court Judge. Active. There it was. Plain. Public. Undeniable. Hadley slumped back, stunned. The clerk cleared her throat, finally finding her voice. Calling case number 29307. Hadley versus East Line Janitorial. Presiding, the Honorable Judge Morales. The defendant, who'd sat like a statue through the earlier mockery, blinked in confusion, glancing from Elena to his trembling folder of notes. His lawyer leaned over. "She's the judge," he whispered. "She's your judge." It was no longer a courtroom. It was a reckoning. Elena sat in silence for a beat longer than necessary. Not to enjoy the moment, but to allow the truth to settle, like dust after a storm. No dramatics, no revenge speech, just the quiet, irreversible flip of a hierarchy that had believed it was untouchable. And still Hadley tried to salvage something. He stood abruptly, smoothing his jacket, attempting a smile. "Your Honor," he said, a shaky laugh forced into the cracks of his voice. We didn't mean any offense. We just didn't recognize." Elena raised one finger. Not harshly, just precisely. It was more effective than a gavel. He sat down. The crowd barely breathed. And then, for the first time since her entrance, Elena spoke. Her voice was calm, deep, but gentle, like the slow current of a river right before a waterfall. "This courtroom," she began, "will proceed as scheduled. Those here to observe may do so respectfully. Those here to perform may leave." A pause. No one left. Because now, everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Because now, she wasn't a maid anymore. She was a mystery unraveled, a lesson unfolding in real time. One man in the gallery whispered. She knew. The whole time. She let them talk. Another nodded, wide-eyed. She walked in like that on purpose. And he was right. Elena hadn't worn that uniform to be deceptive. She had worn it to reveal them, not herself. To show who judged by appearance, who treated power as a costume, who thought worthiness came with fabric, logos, or polished shoes. She hadn't planned a spectacle. She'd planned a mirror, and now they were all staring into it. The silence, after her words, felt deeper than before, like the courtroom had been dropped into a vacuum. People still hadn't moved, not out of respect, but out of shock. Some clutched their phones with the record button frozen mid-frame. Others stared at their shoes, cheeks burning with second-hand shame. The same mouths that had laughed minutes earlier now hung open, unsure whether to apologize, excuse themselves, or simply pretend they had never joined in. Judge Elena Morales sat upright in the seat that once felt like marble myth to the people in the room. But now it was real, and it was hers. She flipped open the case file with the same quiet dignity she had entered with. No glares, no smirks, no speeches, just the law. And that made it all the more devastating. Hadley sat back in his chair, his fingers twitching with discomfort as his own voice echoed back in his memory. Every insult, every smirk, every performance. He glanced behind him at the people who had laughed with him earlier. They avoided his gaze now, peeling away like rats from a sinking ship. The bailiff stood more upright than usual, his voice crisper when he said, "Case 29327 is now in session." Elena nodded once. She didn't look at Hadley. She looked at the papers. "The plaintiff," she said evenly, "claims breach of contract based on Clause 4A. The defendant contests this as an exploitative clause buried without full disclosure." Her voice cut clean through the air, every word sharpened by a calm precision that left no room for ego or flair. She wasn't here for drama. She was here for truth. Hadley's legal team squirmed in their seats. They had expected an easy win, a judge who might skim the papers and sign off. Not this. Not a judge who knew every page, every clause, and every trap they had laid in the fine print. Elena Morales, one of the interns, whispered from the gallery, eyes wide as she read from her phone. "She's a legal prodigy, fast-tracked, small-town background, started in labor law, worked sanitation rights cases pro bono before the bench." Someone beside her muttered, "That's why she wore the uniform. She knew what they'd do." But no one dared speak louder than that. The room now carried the weight of accountability. Every whisper seemed coated in guilt. The janitorial contractor, the real defendant in all this, sat stunned, wringing his hands as if he couldn't believe the tide had turned. For weeks he'd been preparing for defeat. The contract Hadley's company had locked him into was airtight, or so everyone said. A clause written in lawyers' Latin, deadlines designed to trip, penalties crafted to crush small operators. But now that contract was in the hands of someone who understood. Elena turned one page after another, her eyes flicking between the documents and the notes she had marked. She didn't rush. She didn't stall. Every movement was deliberate, surgical, like a surgeon exposing a tumor no one else had dared touch. Then she looked up, not with vengeance, but with clarity. "The clause in question," she said, her tone neutral but firm, was buried beyond reasonable accessibility. In addition, the penalty structure imposed on the defendant meets the legal definition of unconscionable enforcement, based on the precedent from State v. Redmont janitorial. A shift in the gallery. People knew what that meant, at least those who understood the law. The clause wasn't just questionable. It was predatory. Hadley opened his mouth to protest, but the words never left. Elena didn't raise her hand. She didn't scold. She simply looked at him. And that was enough. She continued, "It is the court's preliminary finding that the plaintiff knowingly engaged in exploitative contracting practices intended to entrap the defendant." More murmurs. Someone near the back of the courtroom let out a low, involuntary "wow," and then, almost like a domino tipping into silence, the laughter of earlier transformed into applause. It wasn't loud, not at first. Just a few scattered claps from people who understood the significance, not just of the case, but of the moment. It wasn't about a maid becoming a judge. It was about a system that finally looked inward and saw itself clearly. Elena raised her hand gently, and the applause stopped. "This courtroom," she said, "does not need validation, only understanding. Let us continue." Her control wasn't forceful, it was magnetic. The room followed her not because it had to, but because it wanted to. Even the reporters who had come expecting a routine civil case now leaned forward, realizing they were witnessing something rare. Not just justice served, but justice revealed. Hadley lowered his eyes. The reality had settled. The courtroom had turned. The crowd had seen behind the curtain. And he, the puppeteer, was now just a man tangled in his own strings. And the woman he laughed at, she was leading the show now, without vengeance, without only truth. The verdict had not yet been spoken, but the decision had already arrived. It was in the air. You could feel it in the silence, not the awkward kind that follows embarrassment, but the stillness that tells after something sacred, something undeniable. The courtroom that once buzzed with laughter and judgment now stood in collective reflection. Judge Elena Morales had not raised her voice once. She didn't need to. With every word, every ruling, every calm dismantling of a weaponized contract, she reminded them all of one truth. Real power never announces itself with noise. It arrives through presence. Hadley no longer sat like a man in control. His legs were crossed awkwardly, one arm folded, the other limp beside his briefcase. His eyes no longer scanned the room for validation. They stayed low, focused on a fixed spot on the wood-grain table, as if trying to avoid the reality unraveling around him. His legal team had quieted too. No whispers, no suggestions, no more scrolling through email threads or exchanging snide glances. Their silence wasn't fear, it was shame, because they knew what they'd participated in, and worse, who they had dismissed. And now, the one they laughed at was the one signing their judgment. Elena sat behind the bench like she was born there. Yet nothing about her presence screamed dominance. There was no cruelty in her rulings, no fire behind her gaze, just focus, steadiness, and the unmistakable authority of someone who earned her seat the hard way. And that's what shook them most. She hadn't demanded respect. She had earned it in real time, in front of a crowd that began by mocking her and ended by admiring her. The defendant, Mr. Lee, a small business janitorial contractor, sat blinking rapidly. He looked like a man who'd been thrown a lifeline moments before drowning. His lawyer patted his shoulder, but even she looked stunned by the turn. They had come prepared to lose. Now they were walking out with justice. The final ruling was clean. Judge Morales declared the clause unenforceable, the penalties void. The contract rewritten in the court record with protections added for Mr. Lee's small firm. Not just a victory, but a correction. One that would ripple outward into future litigation, setting precedent. Hadley had lost. But this wasn't just about him. This was about all the people who looked at someone's shoes before listening to their words. about every quiet worker in every shiny office who was overlooked until the day they weren't. The applause came again, stronger this time, not out of celebration but out of recognition, not loud, but powerful. A woman in the back row stood briefly before sitting back down, hand to her chest. She didn't know Judge Morales personally, but she knew what she represented. Every person in the room did now. Respect wasn't a gift you received. It was something people witnessed and couldn't look away from. A man near the door, the same man who had laughed first when Elena entered, quietly slipped out before the session was over. Some truths are too heavy to sit with for long. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. The rumor had spread across legal blogs and news forums in less than an hour. Maid turns out to be judge dismantles explosive lawsuit. But inside, Elena remained composed. She tapped her gavel once. "Court is adjourned," she said, her voice as calm as it was at the beginning. Everyone stood, not because of protocol, but out of something older than rules. Earned respect. As she gathered her notes, Elena placed her binder gently into her leather bag, the same one everyone had assumed held cleaning supplies. She stood and stepped down from the bench. No bailiff flanked her. No guards walked beside her. She walked alone, and yet there wasn't a person in that room who didn't follow her with their eyes. Even Hadley stood. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Some losses leave you speechless, not because of the consequences, but because of what they reveal about who you've become. As Elena passed him, she paused. For the first time all day, she looked at him directly. No anger, no smugness, just truth. Then she walked past, not above him, not beneath him, but beyond him. The transformation in the room was complete. Where there had been laughter, now there was quiet awe. Where there had been mockery, now there was memory. A story people would retell for years, not because of scandal, but because of justice, wrapped in humility. They had called her just a maid. Now they would remember her as a judge who didn't just rule from the bench, she ruled from experience. And that, they would never forget. In the hours after the courtroom cleared, the stories began to spread like sparks from a single flame. Some whispered about the woman who fooled an entire room into mocking their own reflection. Others spoke of a judge who wore humility like a robe heavier than silk. But for those who were there, truly there, the story wasn't about shock. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about recognition. Long after the ruling, long after the bailiff had locked the doors and the cleaning crew returned to polish the very floors. Elena, once scrubbed, her presence lingered in the air, not as myth but as message. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't shamed her mockers. She had simply arrived and revealed that power has never worn just a suit, that wisdom doesn't always come wrapped in degrees on the wall, that true strength is often clothed in simplicity. Watching, waiting, never needing to prove itself. In a world that too often judges by posture and polish, she reminded them all of a deeper truth. It is not what you wear but what you carry that defines you. Elena Morales had carried the weight of 3 jobs, a mother's hospital bills, a dream postponed, and an entire courtroom's arrogance, all without ever asking for sympathy. And still, she rose, not with fury, but with focus. Not with entitlement, but with endurance. She rose because there was work to be done. Because justice had ceilings that needed breaking. Because someone had to remind the world that the quietest people often carry the loudest truths. The robe she wore that day. It wasn't stitched from fabric alone. It was woven from sacrifice, dignity, long nights, and silent endurance. It was tailored by experience and hemmed with humility. And when she walked into that courtroom in her cleaning uniform, she didn't hide who she was. She showed the world exactly what they were too blind to see. She gave them a chance to listen without labels, to see without prejudice. And most of them failed that test. But in failing, they learned, because no one who watched her ascend that bench would ever forget the feeling of their own assumptions collapsing. No one who mocked her silence would ever again mistake quiet for weakness. The intern who snuck a photo that morning deleted it in shame by afternoon. The woman who first laughed wiped her eyes quietly as she left the courtroom. Even Hadley, once untouchable, walked away slower, smaller, the sound of his own cruelty echoing far louder than anyone else's applause. That's the power of truth. It doesn't have to shout, it just has to stand up. Elena never needed revenge. She didn't need to teach them a lesson. She was the lesson. And long after that case, when the next courtroom filled and the next defendant trembled at the weight of an unfair system, her story would become a quiet myth whispered in corners of the courthouse. There was once a judge who wore a janitor's uniform to her own hearing, not to trick, but to reveal. And somewhere in some distant town, a girl in a faded apron would hear that story and realize she wasn't invisible. She was becoming, because what Elena left behind wasn't just a legal precedent. It was a spiritual one, a reminder that greatness often walks past you wearing ordinary shoes. That character is not spoken, it's revealed. That respect isn't demanded, it's earned in the moments when no one is watching. And most of all, that true power is silent. It does not come crashing through doors or wrapped in applause. It walks quietly through laughter, waits patiently in judgment, and rises only when it's ready to change everything. The courtroom would be cleaned again the next day. The floors would shine. The gavel would rest. The microphones would sit in silence. But one seat, the judge's seat, would carry the imprint of a woman who rewrote what it meant to sit there. Not through her name, but through her story. And if anyone ever forgot what she did that day, they'd remember how it felt to be in the presence of someone you underestimated, and to realize too late that they were everything you claimed to be. That is the power of the unseen. That is the legacy of Elena Morales, the maid who made the whole world stand